Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite professor, Dr. Ronald Brown. Our topic for today is something that probably everybody listening to me has encountered, and that is the ethnic neighborhood. Whether in New York, we're thinking of Flushing with all of the Asians, Hispanics at Jackson Heights, Dominicans in Washington Heights, African Americans in Harlem, the Lubavitchers over in Brooklyn. An ethnic neighborhood is something that basically makes the tapestry of New York City. Every immigrant, every refugee, when they arrive in a new city, whether it's in New York or San Francisco, or Paris or Berlin or Moscow or Tel Aviv, people create an ethnic neighborhood. They cluster together. They have the same language, they have the same culture, they like the same food, they like the same music, whatever it is, they cluster together. So what we're going to analyze today is what exactly is an ethnic neighborhood? Well, if you look at the outline on the left, you see I have isolated 6 points. Might be more, but we'll stick with 6. First is a large population. 2 families does not make an ethnic neighborhood. 2 families cannot support a house of worship, build a house of worship, rent a building, turn it into a church, a synagogue, a temple, a mosque, or whatever. Food infrastructure. When people come over, sure, the kids want hamburgers and pizzas, but the family, when they have a wedding, when they have some type of event, they want food from their own country. Education infrastructure. Here again, people build schools. We talk about immigrants coming in. They want to teach their children Arabic if they're Muslim. They want to teach their children Hebrew and maybe go to a yeshiva if they're Jewish. Some ethnic groups, like the Catholics, have gone on and established a whole network of colleges and universities. Cultural infrastructure, music, literature, reading, books, preserving the history, DVDs, even channel television stations. And finally, all of this costs money. So an ethnic group has to have its economic infrastructure. How are you going to pay for this? How are you going to raise money? Are you going to be able to finance the Hajj to Mecca for the poor members of the Muslim community? How are you going to pay for the colleges and everything else? So that is going to be our topic for today. The book on the right is There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. It is the neighborhood, which is the first step in America. You might be from Iran, you grew up in Iran, but when you come to New York, you enter a ethnic Iranian neighborhood. Well, what happens to your kids after that? Who are they going to marry? What college are they going to go to? How much Farsi are they going to remember? Well, that's another issue. But the ethnic neighborhood is step 1 for every immigrant group coming to the United States. So let's get started with our topic for today. Refugees, immigrants, which have been part of human history from the very beginning, but still today they are a major issue. In fact, in the eyes of many people, a major problem. As I'm speaking, the big issue of building the wall to keep out Hispanics, Mexicans, Guatemalans, and even Haitians and other people. Boats crossing from Africa to Europe, bringing in millions of Arabs, millions of Africans seeking refugee status in the United States. Picture on the right at the top, that's me working among the Vietnamese boat people back in the 80s who were fleeing Vietnam. ended up on islands in the South Pacific. And my job was to interview them, make files, and hopefully send them on to a new home in the United States, in France or Germany, Brazil, Sweden, wherever they went. So I have been part of this refugee and mass migration phenomenon. Well, a lot of people don't like immigrants. In fact, it was Donald Trump who built that big, beautiful wall to keep out Hispanics. He was the one who came up with the Muslim ban to keep Muslims out of the country. He wanted to make and keep the United States a white Christian country and get rid of all of these Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Arabs and Jews who were polluting the United States. And many people don't want refugees. When Angela Merkel opened the door of Germany for 1 million immigrants, it was a scandal in the eyes of many. And the Alternative for Deutschland, like many other racist organizations, don't consider themselves racist. They want to keep Germany German, just like Donald Trump wants to keep America white and Christian. So the topic of ethnic neighborhood, where these refugees all ended up, is not just of historic importance, but is a very crucial issue today. So when we talk about an ethnic neighborhood, first thing we need is a significant population. As I said in the introduction, 2 or 3 families do not an ethnic neighborhood make. You need hundreds, if not thousands of families. The classic case here in New York is the Lower East Side. Look at the map on the right. You see East Houston in the upper left-hand corner, going the whole way down to the East River Park, and famous streets like Rutgers, East Broadway, Clinton, famous Essex Street, Orchard Street, Allen, Eldridge Street. I mean, this is a corner of Lower Manhattan that has been an ethnic, constantly changing neighborhood since the American Revolution. The first people who settled there were poor Scots and English. Not all immigrants come with a suitcase full of money. And many of them come absolutely impoverished and live wherever they can and do whatever they can to make a living, and hopefully their children will have a better life. By the mid-1800s, the Scotch and Irish had advanced enough that they could get out of the Lower East Side and move somewhere else. So it was taken over by Irish Germans, and the Germans were Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. So once again, new people moved in. They took over the same buildings. Many times they took over the old Scottish and English churches and made them into synagogues or Catholic or Protestant churches. By the 1870s, the population was changing once again. And this is the Eastern European Orthodox Jews and Italians from southern Italy. They started flooding in. Well, that's when you get your very first Little Italy. There were enough Italians to support an ethnic community. The Eastern European Orthodox Jews from Russia and Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Latvia, Lithuania, settled in, took over the Lower East Side. Once again, they bought the old churches of the Irish or the Germans, or bought the Reform synagogues of the German Jews, turned them Orthodox. Well, as I speak today, we are at the end of another wave of immigration. And these are the Chinese, Asians, and Hispanics who now have taken over the Lower East Side. Once again, taking old synagogues, which were previously churches, and turning them into Buddhist temples. So the Lower East Side is a classic ethnic neighborhood, and it shows how ethnic neighborhood is step one in the immigration process. All these people have moved on. Chinese who have taken over the Lower East Side now will most probably move on when the kids get educated, they learn English, they have some financial success. They'll move out of the small apartment of the Lower East Side and buy a nice house in Westchester County, Long Island, or New Jersey. Well, the ethnic neighborhood throughout history has been a pretty rough place. I just got back from Jackson Heights, and I mean, you see the prostitutes hanging out on the street corner. You see the guys selling drugs out of windows, but you also see people opening up stores, people selling food at the street corner. You do what you have to do. You don't speak English. You're adjusting to a new world. Your family might be scattered or back in the old country. Well, you do what you have to survive. The Lower East Side was, in the mid-1800s, one of the most congested and dangerous neighborhoods in the United States. The famous 5 Points area, filled with gangs, filled with crime, prostitution, alcoholism, opium dens. Look at the picture on the right, and you see all these people crowded into the street. They may have 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment, but as soon as the morning comes, the kids are out playing in the street because there's no place to play at home. The women are buying their food on the street. And of course, you see the wagons being pulled by horses. Well, horses poop and pee everywhere. And so you can imagine the stench on the streets. Now, it was called the Lower East Side for a very good reason. Not because it was in Lower Manhattan, but because it was a swamp. Look at the picture on the left. You see the streets, Pearl Street and Worth and all these other ones. The Lower East Side was low-lying. So when it rained, all the water from the whole area flowed into this swampy area, which meant that if you lived there, every time there was a rainstorm, the basement of your house was going to be flooded. And of course, the flood would drive the rats out of the cellar. Cats and dogs were roaming the streets. The air was filled with mosquitoes and, of course, malaria. So the Lower East Side was not prime real estate, even though they filled it in with dirt from elsewhere, drained the swamp. That's why we have Canal Street, because it was built to drain the water from the swamp into the East River or the Hudson River. Gradually it was filled in, but it was still muddy. It was still filled with buildings like you see on the right, where people did what they could to survive. None of these buildings had bathrooms. You threw your garbage out the window. And the only thing that kept the streets clean were the herds of pigs who ran around, because the pigs will eat almost anything. And so they kept the streets clean. Well, by the mid-1800s and late 1800s, the old buildings made of wood and bricks were being replaced with tenements, sometimes 4 or 5 stories tall. Of course, mid-1800s, there were no elevators, no air conditioning. You had a kitchen, you had to bring boxes of coal or wood to do your cooking. Once again, people spent most of their time outside on the streets, or else in the picture on the right, laundry hanging out, people escaping the heat of a midsummer day by sitting on the balconies or the fire escapes, or even going up to the roof, the famous tar beach, where Hundreds of people on a hot day would go up and just sleep on the roof of the building. So the population continued to grow. By 1900, there were 500,000 Jews in the Lower East Side, crammed into a small area. When we think of millions of people being crammed into a small area, today we refer to Hong Kong as one of the most congested places in the world, or the Israeli-occupied Gaza Strip, with 2 million people literally living one on top of the other, with all of the congestion and pollution that gives rise to. Well, the Lower East Side joins the Gaza Strip and Hong Kong as heavily congested areas. Well, the immigration periods, as you can see on the graph in front of you, shows that there were periods of immigration. You see 1850 was a big German and Irish immigration. Then from 1900 to 1920 was the huge immigration of Italians and Eastern Europeans. And then after World War I, immigration pretty well died down until it was gates of immigration were reopened, and 1965 until today was the biggest immigration ever. Well, these people from 1965 were not Europeans as they were in 1900 migration period. These were Africans, Asians, Hispanics, refugees flooding in from wars, from famine, and people coming in, such as the Mexicans, merely to have a better standard of living. Well, this 1965 until today is not quite accurate, because with the arrival of Donald Trump, and especially September 11, pretty well brought this mass immigration period to an end. Now, each ethnic neighborhood tries to preserve its history, even though the Jews mainly left the Lower East Side and moved elsewhere, and Chinese are moving in and Hispanics are taking over. But still, there is an attempt to remember when the Lower East Side was Scottish or English, or when it was German and Irish, or when it was Eastern European Jewish, or today when it is Chinese or Asian. The Tenement Museum of the Lower East Side tries to recreate the world of these immigrants. On the right, you see the old cook stove, which used coal or wood, not only to cook, but also to heat the place. There was no central heating. See, they maybe had one window on one side. And you can imagine if you were cooking there in the middle of the summer and it was 110 degrees, well, life was not very comfortable. So far, we have a bunch of people, a good number of people settling in a neighborhood. That is the first prerequisite for an ethnic neighborhood. Well, the most beautiful building of most ethnic neighborhoods were the houses of worship. Here we see one of the most beautiful houses of worship in the entire Lower East Side, and this is today the Bialystoker Synagogue. Still, Eastern European Jews maintain the synagogue, even if most of them have since moved elsewhere. Well, like many of the houses of worship in ethnic neighborhoods, when people move on to new neighborhoods, they leave behind their house of worship. This synagogue was originally an English Methodist church built in 1826, and it became an Orthodox synagogue in 1905. Well, house of worship is a house of worship, whether there is an altar in the front with a priest, or a bima with a rabbi, or a imam with the Quran. A house of worship is a house of worship. You can see it has good seating. The acoustics are probably good, has plenty of light coming in from the windows. And this one was very beautifully decorated when it became a synagogue. So the house of worship is central to the ethnic neighborhood. Here are three other examples. The Eldridge Street Synagogue on Eldridge Street in the Lower East Side, recently restored, still, like the Bialystok, a functioning synagogue, although most of the Jews have gone, and most of the synagogue is now given over to a museum, but it was built, proudly maintained by the Orthodox Jews. In the middle, we see the Mother African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. As soon as large numbers of African Americans started moving to Harlem, they not only just took over the apartment buildings and took over the stores and the shops in the neighborhood, but they brought their churches with them. And so they built this one in the 1920s, and it became the anchor of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion African American congregation. On the right, you see a mosque, brand new mosque built in Flushing by a group of Muslims from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Here again, the architecture is beautiful, all three of these buildings, because the house of worship showed that the people were becoming successful in their new homeland. And these buildings remain architectural monuments to the ethnic neighborhood. So everyone who migrated here built their house of worship. The Irish built their churches, the Germans, the Italians, the Chinese, Arabs, African Americans, Greeks, Koreans, Mexicans, and probably at some time in the future, aliens will be building their ethnic neighborhoods. And of course, if it's Chinatown, you're going to have your Buddhist temple. If it's Little Italy, you're going to have your Catholic church. So you have houses of worship, which are central and very often the most beautiful building in the heart of the ethnic neighborhood. On the left, you see St. Nicholas Russian Orthodox Cathedral in the Upper East Side, just off of Fifth Avenue. When the Irish Catholics got some money and some success, what's the first thing they did? Was built St. Patrick's Cathedral. On the right, Indians from southern India built their Ganesha Hindu temple. And of course, it is the most beautiful building in the Indian neighborhood, built in the traditional Southern Indian architectural style. You see all the people in the street because it is the feast and the holiday of the god Ganesha. And so they take the statue of the elephant god, take him from the temple, they parade it up and down the streets. And this is one of the big celebrations of the Southern Indian Hindu congregation. Now, houses of worship were more than just a place where you go to pray. Beside every house of worship was very often a school, whether it was a yeshiva for teaching the kids Hebrew, or mosque school for teaching kids Arabic after they get out of the public school, or whether it is the Catholic Church school staffed by nuns. But there was more than a school and a place of worship. The orphanage, here you see St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum. 1856 it was built. Many women back in the 1850s most women had their babies at home. And if there was a problem, There was no prenatal care or sonograms or anything like that. Many women would die, many babies would die. So every religious group had its orphanage. Homes for old people. Of course, most people just stayed with their children and died at home, but there were abandoned elderly people whose children died or they didn't have children, so you needed homes for elderly. Charity hospitals for the millions of poor people who couldn't afford to go to the doctor. Hospitals. Even banks. Every religious group had its own bank. If you were an Irish Catholic, you would never go to a Jewish bank. They wouldn't even talk to you. If you were an Orthodox Jew and you went to the Irish Catholic Emigrant Bank, they would kick you out in the street. I mean, a Catholic would never go to a Protestant-run bank. And so every group had its own banks. And finally, the leader of the religious group was usually the most educated person in the beginning. Whether it was the Irish Catholic priests who came with the Irish, whether it was a rabbi, one of the very few who came with the Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe, or today it's an imam who leads the community, plays a certain role. Your kid's arrested by the police. Well, the Catholic priest can go down and talk to the cops and, try to get the kid on the straight path. So a house of worship very often was surrounded by a whole social, medical, economic infrastructure of buildings. This tradition of building beautiful buildings is still with us today. Muslim community built the Islamic Culture Center in 1991, a monument to Islamic modern architecture. It's forward-looking. AME Zion, when they moved to Harlem in 1925, they adopted the same European-style Gothic architecture to show that they were part of Western culture. There's no African influence on this. It was purely European architecture. The third element of any ethnic neighborhood is, of course, food. I mean, we're used to seeing Italian restaurants and pizza shops, these famous 99-cent slice pizza places where I hang out. We see them all over. They're not associated with an ethnic neighborhood anymore. Chinese restaurants, there's one on every corner. Or Chez Josephine, a French restaurant. Well, there was never a large French community in New York City, but yet originally, every ethnic neighborhood wanted its own food. So, for example, an Italian neighborhood had Italian restaurants. Well, of course, other people went because they had good Italian wine, all of the pizza and spaghetti and rigatoni and ravioli, and that was part of the ethnic infrastructure. Chinese neighborhoods. Well, of course, they have the best Chinese restaurants. They don't serve this stuff that they give for Western Europeans, but still, food was part of the ethnic infrastructure. That's where you go for your weddings. That's where you go for your holiday meals. That's where you go to have good food, just like back home. They speak your language. They'll have your wine. They'll prepare the food like you want. Chez Josephine, that's a French restaurant, even though there were not a lot of French people in New York. That is Jean-Claude Becker. Josephine is Josephine Baker in English, who settled in Paris to escape the racism of the United States. And her adopted son, Jean-Claude Becker, opened this restaurant in Lower Manhattan. So with the arrival of the Italians and the Chinese and the Germans and the Russians and the Greeks, food in America became global. Of course, you have in the Lower East Side and in Jewish neighborhoods more than just a restaurant, but according to Orthodox Jewish law, the food has to be kosher. Very famous Katz's Deli was recently in the news. Never claimed to be kosher, but it had good Jewish style food. Yonah Shimon, on the right since 1910, has been a bakery shop where they would make Eastern European food. And this was central to the Lower East Side when it was a Jewish neighborhood. You go to Flushing, I mean, everything is available. All of the most exotic things you can want. I love to go to a Chinese grocery store near my place here in Elmhurst, and I go to the fish tanks and you see all of these strange creatures swimming around. And I wonder, my God, how do you prepare them? Are they good? Or fruits and vegetables and spices, strange candies. You never know whether it's going to be spicy or sweet. Beverages, you have no idea what the taste is. Beers and wines from every country under the sun. So once again, new immigrants want foods from home. You can't have a nice festive Chinese dinner without authentic Chinese food. I never saw so many kinds of rice as you see in an Asian grocery store. For me, rice is rice. I know there's brown rice and I know there's white rice, and I should eat brown rice and not white rice. But other than that, I don't really know what kind of rices even exist. But you go to a Chinese grocery store and you're going to have an entire aisle filled just with different kinds of rice. The Hispanic bodegas, all kinds of Spanish drinks. I buy my Inca Cola there, which comes from Peru, very famous Peruvian cola. It's a little bit on the sweet side, but it's good. You can get all kinds of spices, tropical foods, all kinds of beverages. You can buy beer and other beverages from your home country. The Botanica, once again, sells all kinds of religious items. You see statues of Jesus, statues of the Buddha. You see the menorahs and stars of David. You see all kinds of superstitions. I went in once and one of my students bought a candle that had a prayer on it. So if you light the candle and you put it on your desk when you're taking a test, you're guaranteed to get an A+. Well, I won't tell you if it worked or not, but I did make a bit of a stink because we were not supposed to have candles and lit matches in the classroom, but I told her we'll sit beside the window and the smoke goes out the window and we'll see what happens. But this is, once again, institutions in every neighborhood. Go to an Indian area, such as Lower Manhattan or Jackson Heights. There's an entire street of restaurants and stores from India. And here again, this is vegetarian. Muslims have their halal food. Jews have their kosher. Indians have their vegetarian restaurants. I mean, half of the foods, I don't even know what they are again, but just so they're not too spicy and I'm willing to give them a try. And these traditions, like I said at the beginning, have spread. You find Chinese restaurants everywhere. You find Italian restaurants everywhere. But when the Italians started migrating, most Americans didn't know what pizza or spaghetti was. And it was going to the Italian neighborhood, which was the big gastronomical experience. African Americans have their own tradition of soul food. Here you see Sylvia, who migrated to New York from the South and brought her soul food with her. She is the queen of soul food at her restaurant, but she also has her own line of Southern spices, her own canning service of black-eyed peas. And on the right, you see her products, golden cornbread and muffin mix. So here again, food is central to every ethnic neighborhood. Now, education, as I mentioned early on, every church, mosque, synagogue, temple has an educational component. Now, it might be giant, such as we see the yeshiva, which in the Lower East Side, which dates from 1907, as a boarding area so that the guys can live there and attend classes and pray, as a huge library. And this still is functioning, even though most of the Jews no longer live there, and it is completely surrounded by Chinese-owned businesses and apartments. Still, it is a very important part of every ethnic community. Education in the religion, in the traditions. This church on the left is just down the street on Queens Boulevard. And you see the church, big church on Queens Boulevard. And beside it, you see a massive school. This is a typical Catholic neighborhood school. Kids go to the school. Today, a lot of them are closing because more and more kids just want to go to the regular public school. And like with yeshivas, the tuition can be rather steep at times. But this is typical, and you still see it all over. And this is a relatively modern church. On the right is Chinatown. That's our Church of Transfiguration. Once again, with a school beside it. That's an interesting church on Mott Street. And it was originally a Protestant church, and then it was bought by the Catholics when the Irish came over. And today it is predominantly a Chinese Catholic church. And you see the signs in front of the building are written now in Chinese, but it still again shows that education was a component of every ethnic neighborhood. Well, the Catholics were very much into education, as were Orthodox Jews. In fact, you see Columbia University, which goes back to 1754, which was founded by the Episcopal Church. In the middle, you see Fordham University, 1841, founded by the Irish Catholics. And Yeshiva University on the right, 1886, founded as a yeshiva in the Lower East Side and grew to become a giant university. These were very important in raising the standard of living of the Irish, of the English, and of the Orthodox Jews, teaching them modern skills, providing the community with doctors and lawyers and teachers and social workers. Education was part of every ethnic neighborhood. Hospitals. The left, you see the Irish Catholic Hospital, St. Vincent's. Lenox Hill Hospital was the old German hospital. Beth Israel Medical Center, the Jewish Hospital Center. I mean, whether it's Mount Sinai or any other hospital in most major American cities, every ethnic group built its hospital. Now, of course, Orthodox Jews wanted to make sure that the food was kosher, that men and women were kept separate. The Germans, well, they wanted a good quality hospital where they could have German food. Somebody could sneak in a bottle of German beer, and they could speak German with the doctor. St. Vincent's, Irish Catholics. Once again, the Irish were not welcome at the English or German or Jewish hospitals. They had to build their own. Well, central to education for every immigrant group is a job. You want to move ahead. If you're an Irish immigrant, the only thing you know is growing potatoes in Ireland. Well, when you got to New York, you might do day jobs, doing whatever you could to make a living. But every ethnic group realized that education was central. Today, the Chinese have their after-school academy, kindergarten, after-school academy. I mean, every Chinese neighborhood has half a dozen private after-schools. Children go there, go to the public school all day long, and they'll go to the Chinese school in the evening or the Korean school on weekends. I have friends who their kids seem to be always in school, public school all day, then private Vietnamese school, and then yoga and meditation on the weekends, and they're spending half of the day in the library. Of course, in New York, every kid wants to go to Stuyvesant High School and eventually on to Harvard University. Stuyvesant High School is probably the most competitive public school in New York City, and I believe it is now 80% Asian, because the Asians take education extremely seriously and have their entire educational infrastructure, which they have built. Number 5, cultural infrastructure. No immigrant group wants to lose its language, lose its traditions, lose its history. And so in addition to building educational systems for kids and for young people to go to university and college, every ethnic group built its linguistic and cultural infrastructure. On the left, you see the Daily Forward building, founded by Eastern European Orthodox Jews in 1897, and this building was built in 1911. It was the center of the Yiddish language publication. On the right, you see Vorwärts, which is the Yiddish language newspaper. You can see 1897, the very first issue, volume 1, number 6. It's written in Hebrew letters, but the language is Yiddish, which is a mixture of German, Hebrew, and various other Eastern European languages. In fact, Vorwärts is actually German, Vorwärts, which means to go forward. Well, the building was a monumental publication building. At the top, you see the clock, and underneath, you can see the Yiddish word for Vorwärts. Well, this published books, published all kinds of brochures and everything that was necessary for the Yiddish-speaking community. The newspaper was where you went to find information on the Orthodox community in New York, what was going on in Russia, people looking for jobs, trying to get rid of a daughter and find her a husband, all kinds of want ads would be advertised in the newspaper. In fact, Vorwärts had a very famous column, was called a Bintele Briefe, which means a bundle of letters, where a family or a person would write in a question to the newspaper, and the newspaper would answer it, sort of even daily things. How's the best way to get rid of an unfaithful husband, or who knows what they were asking about, how to get pregnant or how to stop getting pregnant. I mean, all these real personal issues would be discussed in a safe Orthodox Jewish environment. The New York Amsterdam News, the largest African-American newspaper in the country. El Diario, the Hispanic newspaper. Ruskoye Slova, the Russian language newspaper. Above that, you see Chinese on the left, New China Press. Look at the advertisement on the first page. Smart Sat, preparing the kids to take the SAT test. First page on the newspaper. The bottom on the right, you see the various languages of newspapers from India. So here again, newspapers were crucial to preserving the ethnic identity. And of course, the kids had to learn the language so that they could read the Chinese or the Russian or the Spanish newspaper. Many immigrant groups built cultural centers. This is the new Bukharian Cultural Center at Forest Hills. In fact, I recognize some of the people below it. So they are Jews from one of my students is on the left there. They were built, it was built by the Bukharian community. Bukharian Jews are from Central Asia. We were part of the Soviet Empire for decades. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of the Jews left and settled in Forest Hills. On the right is the new Forest Hills Synagogue, Bukharian Synagogue. On the left, you see a construction site that is now a skyscraper of apartments for the Bukharian community. They have concerts, they have lectures, programs, they publish their own newspapers. Once again, keeping the Bukharian Orthodox Jews, if they can, separate from other Orthodox Jews. So it's preserving the cultural identity, languages, music, art, and traditions. The Museum of the Chinese in America also is an educational institution, as is the Italian American Museum, not just in exhibits, but publishing books, making movies, collecting documentation. A couple of years ago, I was walking around. Thursday night is garbage night in Jackson Heights and Forest Hills, Queens. So I always go out for a walk right after sunset and find all kinds of treasures in the trash. Well, evidently, there was a family that had moved, and they were Italians, and they had moved somewhere else, and I don't know what. And the new people were throwing out a lot of the junk that was left in the basement. So I found this big trunk that it still had the seals glued to the outside, saying where they came from in Italy, what their address was in New York. So they had this big giant chest shipped over from Italy with probably clothing and other personal items, and it was just thrown on the street. So I called down to the Italian American Museum and said, this is what I have. Oh, they were thrilled to get it, sent up a truck, picked it up, and so that was my contribution. So these groups collect information, they have lectures, they educate the next generation of Italians what their ancestors went through, what life was like back in Italy or China. Well, in addition to books and newspapers, which fewer and fewer people read, preserving the history, educating the younger generation is now the domain of movies, CDs, DVDs, concerts of young people in music. And this is another educational instrument. I have so many friends who play turn on the television and they have cartoons translated into their particular language. So it might be a cartoon made by Hollywood, but it is translated into all these languages. And so the kids are not even aware of it, but they are learning good Russian or Chinese or Korean or Spanish or Urdu or any other language. They're learning the language by hearing it spoken. So the kids won't forget their language. They're not even aware that they're actually learning their language of their family by listening to music, listening to concerts, listening to cartoons. Historic buildings also are educational. See on the left, the old German library and hospital on the left, made of German red bricks. Along the top of the library, you see the great writers of Germany. And the Germans came over and they would go to the library for books to keep up the language. They would go to lectures, labor unions had meetings in it. On the right, you see the Liederkranz, founded in 1847. This was a German singing society. Choral groups are very famous in Germany. In fact, my family, which is German background, my sister and brother-in-law are member of a Liederkranz in Pennsylvania, and they go singing all over the place. A lot of the songs are in English, but they always have a good number of old German songs. So these are educational. I mean, when they keep the sign up on front of buildings, even though the German library is now, as you can see from the flag, part of the New York Public Library system, still the building instructs the visitors on German history in New York. Books, of course, abound in preserving the history, whether it's the Chinese in America or the middle book, Skywalkers, the role of the Mohawk Indians who built the skyscrapers and bridges of New York City. The Mohawk Indians had their ethnic neighborhood in the middle of Brooklyn with their own church, their own clubs, their own bars, intermarrying to keep their jobs in the ethnic community. Trade unions and community, the role of forming trade unions among the German in New York City. Here again, instructing the younger people of the importance of the ethnic community. And of course, what better way to remind people that they are Puerto Rican or Mexican or Dominican or Muslim or Irish or Hindu than the many ethnic parades. Now, when we have St. Patrick's Parade, well, that's fun on the street and everybody drinks green beer. But don't forget that same evening, PBS and other television stations are going to be showing a host of programs devoted to the Irish. And there'll be PBS documentaries, there will be stories about Ireland, about building St. Patrick's Cathedral, or the role of the Catholic Church among the Irish, or the history of every street corner Irish pub. So parades, whether it's the American Muslim Day Parade, where they will have histories of Islam on television, or the Puerto Ricans celebrating their own unique culture. The Indians, when it's Ganesha, well, you're going to be television programs, there are going to be lectures. I do that a lot. When it's St. Patrick's Day, I'll be hired by a library to give a talk on St. Patrick's Day or on some other aspect of Irish history. Now, finally, how are you going to pay for all of this? This is the million-dollar question. Immigrants like the Irish, the Eastern European Jews, they basically spent every penny they had to get across the Atlantic. And when they arrived, they were unceremoniously dumped in the Lower East Side in cramped tenement apartments, doing whatever they could to keep alive. The men would go out and look for day jobs. The women, who were either pregnant or nursing or both, or 4 or 5 small kids, had to stay home. But even the housewife would take in sewing. And that was a very common job for women. Many women would rent floor space for new immigrants who had no place to live or couldn't afford a place. They would give her some coins and they would be allowed to sleep on the floor, which would be out away from the elements. Sometimes she would cook them a breakfast or mend their clothes while they went out and looked for a job, day job, or something else. So women were major sources of income, even though they couldn't leave the home, that they turned the home into a veritable hotel, restaurant, and textile factory. Well, of course, every ethnic group built its own banks. On the left, we see Yarmolinsky's Bank, founded by Sender Yarmolinsky in 1873. And this building was built in 1911. It still stands, but it is now a Chinese apartment store. But they have kept the sign in the front. Now, when the Orthodox Jews came over, they did what they had to. They hustled to make some money. But one of their goals was to send money back to Russia or Poland or Lithuania to bring over other relatives, or maybe to bring over their parents. So they really did what they had to survive themselves, but then bring over the rest of the family. So Yarmolinsky provided this service. Now, in 1873, there were no credit cards. People couldn't just write a check or send a MoneyGram to Imperial Russia. It had to be done through a bank. So Yarmolinsky would take their dollars. He would contact somebody back in Russia. That person would, of course, take a cut in the money. And gradually, though, the person who was a recipient got enough money to come over and do the same thing, start working, send money back to Russia to bring over their family. Today, we still see a lot of ethnic banks, the Banco do Brasil or the Chinese banks. Here again, you can go in. You know that they're going to speak your language. They're going to be able to transfer money from New York to Brazil to help their parents who are back in Brazil. Or the bank can transfer money to family back in China. Now, in the beginning, when you had the Yarmolinsky's Bank and you had the Irish banks, they also were very important because if an Orthodox Jew went to an Irish Catholic bank, they didn't know who that person was. So they would never give them a loan. They would never trust them. So the banks were a place where every ethnic group felt at home. Well, every ethnic group, once again, had to hustle. When the Irish came, they were lucky because the government was building Central Park. They got good jobs. When the Italians came, New York was building its first skyscrapers and building the subway. So the Italians got jobs. Following the First World War, when large numbers of Eastern European Orthodox Jews started coming to New York, they had contacts with the South African Jews who were deeply involved in the diamond industry. And so they transformed West 47th Street into the Diamond Street. Look at the picture on the left. Look at the lamp posts. The very top is a giant glass diamond. Jewelers on Fifth Avenue. This is 47th Street, just off of Fifth Avenue, almost across from St. Patrick's Cathedral. You see guys on the street analyzing diamonds, money changing hands. A very good friend of mine was Harry Winston, who was the diamond king of Fifth Avenue. His big store was there. I got to know him when I lived in Switzerland, and he would come and stay at the hotel where I was working. And I worked overnight. So I was the night porter for a couple of years. And so Harry would come into the hotel in the evening. Well, if it was quiet, we would just sit in the lobby and he would tell me all of his stories of growing up, getting into the diamond industry, and becoming the greatest diamond dealer of New York. Marilyn Monroe in one of her movies is getting dressed for a big engagement or something, and she can't decide which diamonds to put on. And so in the middle of the movie, she yells out, "Harry Winston, where are you?" Because he was the king of diamonds. Well, not every group was able to get into the diamond industry. The Italian mafia, as in The Godfather and the Five Families, the mafia hustled to make a living. In fact, the building that I live in here in Queens was built by the Russian mafia, one of the big dons. He started to launder some of his money by building modest apartment buildings. And he went legit. But a lot of the Italians had their drugs. Chinese drug gangs were famous. Today, it's the Dominicans and the Mexican drug gangs. A new immigrant group does what it can to survive. Not everybody can open stores like the one on the right, where they are selling jewelry and clocks and whatnot. So you do what you have to survive. And in this rough and tumble world of new immigrants, sometimes it was absolutely necessary to get a bit brutal. The Koreans took over the nail salons. In fact, when I first moved to New York, I was teaching these girls basic English because they were just in from Korea. Many of them were illegals. They had never learned English in school, but they could do nails. So I would teach them how to say, good morning, how are you? The basic terminology for nails. Many of the new immigrants, such as the Mexican day laborers, stand on street corners in parking lots, waiting for a job. This guy in the white shirt on, he has a leaf blower. So it's probably the fall, and he's goes up to a house and says, "I'll clean up your yard. You pay me. I'll shovel snow. I'll paint your house. I'll even work in construction." So you have to make money. And a lot of these Korean girls and these Mexican day laborers, they end up sending a lot of money back to their family back in Korea or in Mexico, either to bring them over or to educate their nieces and nephews and sometimes children back in the old country, buy them uniforms, buy them books so that they can maybe amount to a little bit more than a lot of people. Filipino nurses are famous. In fact, universities in the Philippines train nurses. They get not only a Filipino diploma and nursing license, but they get the license for New York or California. They have their graduation ceremony, and the very next day they're on the plane for their job in the United States. And this is not just Filipino nurses, but doctors. I went recently to have a procedure, and there was only one person who dealt with me who was a native-born American, and that was the anesthesiologist. The doctor was from Saudi Arabia. All the staff in the office were Hispanics. The nurses were Filipinos and Thais. Even the woman who checked me in and took care of the insurance was from Jamaica. So now people are getting organized so that when they arrive from the Philippines, they have their newly printed diploma. They arrive one day and they are back the very next day in the operating room. So here again, though, making a living is very important. And a lot of these people are, like with the Mexicans, sending money back to the Philippines or Thailand or wherever they come from to educate their younger brothers and sisters in a better school, to buy uniforms and books, maybe even come to New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles for a summer to work on their English. Well, of course, you have to hustle. Making a living in a city like New York, if you have no education and no skills, you do what you can. Well, sometimes you don't get away with it, and you end up with the NYCPD, New York City Police Department, Manhattan, and you spend time in a luxury resort called Rikers Island. Girls can always make a decent living if they have the body for it. Guys are always available to get into the drug trade, which is, of course, very dangerous and can end up with a loss of life. But still, when you're a new immigrant, you have to hustle. So that is all. Welcome to the wonderful world of ethnic neighborhoods. If you'd like to contact me, feel free at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. And life in the ethnic neighborhood goes on. Whenever I give a walking tour of the Lower East Side, I talk about the English and Scottish and the Irish and the Germans and the Eastern European Jews, and today the Chinese and Hispanics. I'm half waiting to be walking around the Lower East Side and encounter the very first aliens migrating from Mars or Jupiter or some other galaxy, showing up and starting to move into the tenements of the Lower East Side. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. I mean, migration is booming, legal or illegal, and it's only a question of time before the aliens start showing up. So thank you very much for joining me and exploring the wonderful wild world of the ethnic neighborhood. So I hope to see you sometime in the future. I hope you enjoyed the program and look forward to talking to you again. Okay, have a good day. I shall see you in the future. Bye-bye.